Good evening and welcome to Gravitas. I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay. Let's get started. For more than a year now, as we have been reporting on this pandemic, we've been saying one thing. The key to ending it is vaccines. And vaccines not just for the rich, wealthy and powerful countries and their people, but vaccines for the whole world. Because this virus travels irrespective of how powerful a country is. It knows how to breach borders. And we've been saying that it's important to waive vaccine patents for the whole world to be able to use these life-saving drugs. India and South Africa, as we've been reporting, has been pushing for a patent waiver at the World Trade Organization. There was a lot of resistance. Pharma lobbies, rich countries, they all blocked India's proposal. But tonight we are happy to report that a major shift has happened. The United States has thrown its weight behind India's move. Joe Biden, after initial resistance for months now, has finally said that America supports vaccine patent waivers. And many other countries were quick to make that shift along with the US. There are still hurdles on the way, but this is a major shift. It's a long road ahead for the whole world to be able to get these vaccines. But it's a start nonetheless. Tonight we'll tell you what happened at the WTO and what lies ahead. Also on the show, Britain and France are at loggerheads. Naval ships have been deployed. What are they fighting over? Fish. We'll explain. Brazil's President Bolsonaro, who famously kept denying the pandemic for the longest time, now says it's an act of bio-war. A survey conducted across 50 countries has thrown up some stunning results. America is the biggest threat to democracy, followed by big tech and China. And as French President Macron pays a tribute to Napoleon, we bring you his story, the Emperor. Also the debate on how we should treat history and its characters. We begin as always with Gravitas Global Headlines.
The group of 7 advanced economies labeled China as a bully, saying that China was guilty of human rights abuses. The foreign minister urged Beijing to refrain from ramping up tensions in the east amid concerns over its conflict with Taiwan. China calls the statement an interference in its internal affairs. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken visits Kyiv in a show of support after Russia massed troops near Ukraine's eastern border. This after US President Joe Biden pledged unwavering support to Ukraine in April as Russia deployed troops and weapons to the border. German company CureVac's new vaccine will not require the doses to be kept in a deep freezer like those of Pfizer and Moderna, making the shots easy to store and transport. CureVac's product belongs to what many scientists refer to as the second wave of COVID-19 vaccines, which could collectively ease the global demand. Debris from a Chinese rocket which sent part of a planned space station into orbit is likely to fall in international waters, amid concerns that the rocket is out of control and could cause damage on re-entry to Earth. China's Global Times describes the reports as Western hype. Australia says that China's decision to freeze regular bilateral trade is disappointing. This marks a new low in bilateral ties after China suspended the China-Australia Strategic Economic Dialogue. Kidnappers have released the remaining 29 students who were held captive nearly 2 months after abducting them from a forestry college in Nigeria's Kaduna state. the police has not allowed the media to speak to the released students. More than 700 people have been abducted for ransom from schools in northwest Nigeria since December. Unrest in Colombia continues for the 8th straight day as riot police fires tear gas at protesters in Bogota after crowds attacked police stations in the capital. The demonstrators who initially showed their opposition to a now cancelled tax reform plan are now protesting against poverty, police violence and inequality in education. An unverified video shows a French journalist who disappeared in Mali last month, saying that he had been kidnapped by a jihadist group as he pleaded for help from French authorities. Olivier Dubois says that he was kidnapped by a local Islamist group affiliated to the Al-Qaeda. Chelsea are through to the final of the UEFA Champions League for the first time since 2012 after a convincing 2-0 second-leg victory over Real Madrid in London. Timo Werner opened the scoring on the half-hour mark and Chelsea dominated the record 13 champions in the second half before Mason Mount netted a late second. Thomas Tuchel's side will now face fellow English side Manchester City in the final in Istanbul on May 29th. Pfizer will donate doses of its COVID-19 vaccine to athletes and officials around the world participating in the Tokyo Olympics. The International Olympic Committee has announced an MOU under which delivery of doses will begin by the end of May, with the aim of having second shots available before delegations arrive in Tokyo for the Games, starting on July 23rd. Various national Olympic committees will identify participants and work with their local governments to coordinate distribution in accordance with each country's individual vaccine guidelines.
India's numbers are going from bad to worse. More than 412,000 new cases, the highest number of new infections India has reported in a single day, 412,000 plus. As for deaths, close to 4,000. That's another grim record. Total fatalities in India have now crossed the 230,000 mark, 230,000 people. There are 3.5 million active cases, the second highest in the world. As many as 12 states in India have more than 100,000 positive patients. The recoveries remain steady. More than 329,000 patients recovered in the last 24 hours. In all, more than 17 million people have recovered since last year. What about the peak that was being predicted this week? Well, now experts say it might be weeks away. Like we told you last night, India is now bracing for a third wave, and frankly, it comes as no surprise. Around the world, the pandemic is playing out in cycles. First wave, then a lull, then second wave, and a sudden explosion of cases. The West has been through this. Look at the pattern. In April last year, the United States was reporting more than 32,000 cases per day. Then the curve flattened. But in July, new infections climbed up again. At its peak, the US was reporting more than 70,000 cases in July 2020. That's almost double the number of cases compared to the first wave. After this, America's numbers kept going up. That was the third wave. By January this year, the US was reporting almost 300,000 cases in a day. New infections increased by 9 times. Same with fatalities. During the first wave in April 2020, the US reported more than 2,000 deaths a day. By January 2021, that's around the peak of the third wave, America was reporting around 4,000 deaths in a day. So deaths doubled by the third wave. Now we're in the month of May. The pandemic is on the retreat in America thanks to an aggressive vaccination campaign. By the end of last month, April end, new cases in the US had declined by as much as 26%, and now people can take off their masks in less crowded places. That should give you hope. What about Europe? Look at the graph again. April last year, Europe was reporting around 35,000 new cases a day. This was the first wave. By November 2020, Europe was gripped by the second wave, new infections zooming past 300,000 per day. This was the highest number of daily infections that Europe has reported in this pandemic. We saw new peaks in January and March this year, but the new infections, that figure remained well below the 300,000 mark during these months. What about fatalities? In April last year, Europe reported about 3,000 deaths per day. By the end of November, they crossed 6,000. January 2021, this year, Europe reported around 7,000 deaths per day. Now, Europe too is taming the virus. Restrictions are being lifted. In the last 14 days, new cases in European Union countries have dropped by almost 30%. So how did America and Europe control their surge? Two things: targeted lockdowns and aggressive vaccination. India too needs a mix of these two. As of today, at least 21 states and union territories have imposed restrictions in India. That covers around 81% of the country's population. So India's numbers are not the worst in the world. What's making India's surge the scariest is the shortages, and they're far from over. Now, with the threat of a third wave looming, India needs to ramp up its infrastructure quickly, not just for adults, but also for children, citizens below 18 years of age. They make up 30% of India's population, 30. India has to start thinking about them, about vaccinating them. But India, we know, is struggling to vaccinate even those above 18. So where will it get the shots for kids? Well, there's some good news on that front. Although we have a long way to go, it's a big win for India. The United States has supported India's proposal on patent waivers, which means vaccine recipes can be unlocked now. India has been pushing for this for many months now, but rich countries like the US, Canada and the UK had been blocking India's efforts at the World Trade Organization. Now that has changed. The Biden administration made a shift today. Let me bring you a part of the statement from the US Trade Representative that came last night. This is a global health crisis, and the extraordinary circumstances of the COVID-19 pandemic call for extraordinary measures. The administration believes strongly in intellectual property protections, but in service of ending this pandemic, supports the waiver of those protections for COVID-19 vaccines. Extraordinary circumstances call for extraordinary measures. That is true. Also, pressure works. Remember, 100 countries have backed the proposal by India and South Africa. America was under pressure to play ball, and it has. India has welcomed the shift. New Delhi has said it hopes this waiver can be approved quickly at the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Washington's decision is having a domino effect now. The European Union, which was earlier blocking the resolution, has now said it is ready to, quote-unquote, discuss the matter.
The European Union is also ready to discuss any proposal that address the crisis in an effective and pragmatic manner. And that's why we are ready to discuss how the US proposal for waiver on intellectual property protection for COVID vaccines could help achieve that objective.
Germany said the same. It is ready for a dialogue. So discussion and dialogue, that's far from any commitment, but it's a start nonetheless. France has announced its support to the waiver. So has New Zealand. Even China has weighed in with a cryptic statement. Beijing said that it expects an effective, and I'm quoting, effective and balanced result from the discussions around the proposed waiver. And speaking of China, the chief of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, has called this a monumental decision. So it seems everyone finally agrees with everyone, which is a great move. But what happens next? More diplomatic hurdles. The World Trade Organization operates on the basis of consensus. It has 164 countries as members. And now for the resolution to pass, for any resolution to pass, all 164 countries must agree. Imagine achieving that. Diplomacy is hard work. In the last 7 months, the WTO held as many as 10 meetings on the original proposal, and all of them failed, no agreement. Here is a list of countries that are now holding back this waiver. Australia, Brazil, Canada, the European Union, Japan, Norway, Switzerland, the United Kingdom. For the resolution to pass, all of these countries must change their stand. Where does that leave us? Another proposal. India and South Africa will now present a revised proposal next month. That's what reports say. Details about this revised proposal are still not clear, but it's expected to focus on some key points. Number one, how new production sites can get vaccine patents. Number two, how countries must commit to a transparent regulatory infrastructure to manufacture these vaccines. And number three, how do we compensate pharma companies for waiving patents? Which brings us to the question, how are pharma companies taking this news? Not very well. Their stocks plummeted after America's announcement. Pfizer and Moderna were down by more than 3%. BioNTech, the company that made the Wuhan virus vaccine with Pfizer, fell by almost 17%. CureVac, another German company that is making a shot, was down by around 16%. The prospect of losing out on profits is making them bleed. But they haven't given up yet. Pharma lobbies have swung into action, quick to condemn President Biden's decision. The Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America is the lobbying arm of this industry. Its CEO called the waiver an empty promise. He said the waiver, and I'm quoting, "The waiver does nothing to address the real challenges to getting more shots in arms, including last-mile distribution and limited availability of raw materials." He has a point there. This group was the third highest spender on lobbying in America. It spent more than $25 million on influencing lawmakers, and now it's not playing out as they planned, so they had to complain. Same with the United Kingdom. Pharma lobbyists are up in arms.
Intellectual property rights are the lifeblood of this industry. Without it, businesses simply can't invest. We are disappointed about the news coming out of the US yesterday. We think it will do more harm than good.
Now, all of this was expected, and this resistance can be overcome if governments put their mind to it. But bigger challenges await us. Patent waiver is just the first step. Vaccine makers can only scale up production if they have the necessary supplies in hand. A typical vaccine manufacturing plant will use around 9,000 different materials to make a shot, 9,000. And these materials come from around 300 suppliers spread out across 30 countries. These raw materials and ingredients need to be sourced and delivered. Manufacturing process and production lines must be scaled up. Supply chains need to be built up to ensure last-mile connectivity. Like I said in the beginning, it's a long road ahead. And work on all of this must begin right now, even as WTO members sit down to negotiate this waiver, because the world is already late in providing vaccines for all. Now let me give you a list. A successful TRIPS waiver, the one we just spoke about. An unofficial ban on HUAWEI. Customer restrictions on Amex. And a potential trade deal with the European Union. In the last 14 days, New Delhi has made 4 strategic moves in 4 different sectors, and all of them are aimed at keeping India's place intact in the global order. Efforts aimed at upholding national interest even in times of adversity. Here's a report.
A successful TRIPS waiver, an unofficial ban on HUAWEI, customer restrictions on Amex, and the revival of trade talks with the European Union. These are 4 significant moves India has made, policy decisions that safeguard India's natural place in the global order. This story begins on the 23rd of April. The Reserve Bank of India imposed restrictions on 2 financial services giants. The American Express Banking Corporation, or Amex, and the Diners Club International, both barred from signing up new customers on their credit card network. Why? Because they flouted rules and refused to store financial data in India. The RBI's decision does not impact existing customers, but it will go a long way in stopping data breaches and financial scams, not to mention make other credit card issuers follow the rules. On the 4th of May came the second big step, this time in the telecom sector. India quarantined China's fastest horse in the 5G race, HUAWEI. The departure of telecommunications barred Huawei from the upcoming 5G trials. Why? For the obvious reason: cybersecurity. The risk Huawei poses to telecom sectors globally has long been established. Countries like Australia, Japan, the US, the UK, Czech Republic and Sweden have already banned or restricted Huawei, accusing it of serving as a vector for Chinese espionage. India's decision was a long time coming, and it hurts Huawei's prospects in a market that is as big as China's. The third big strategic win came on the 5th of May. The European Union announced that it will revive stalled trade talks with India. An India-EU summit will be held on May 8th. If an agreement is reached, not only will India benefit in securing a resilient medical supply chain, it will also pull the European Union away from China, its biggest competitor in the Indo-Pacific. The EU has already rejected plans to ratify a trade deal with Beijing. Reports say it's only a matter of time before it signs one with New Delhi. And on May 6th, it came the fourth big strategic win, this one in the health sector. The Biden administration announced its support to India's proposal, lifting patent protections to help produce more vaccines globally. The Indian embassy in Washington, led by Ambassador Taranjit Singh Sandhu, was joined by South African embassy officials in pursuing US lawmakers and the World Trade Organization for a temporary waiver. With Washington voicing its support, it shouldn't be long before a global consensus is reached. 14 days, 4 strategic wins, 4 different sectors. India has shown how national interest can be upheld even in times of adversity. Bureau Report, WION. World is One.
2020 wasn't just a pandemic, it was also an infodemic. It mainstreamed conspiracy theories, amplified narratives which were otherwise hard to digest. With the new year, we thought we'd left all of this behind. But just like the virus, conspiracy theories too are back. Who set the ball rolling this time? This leader, Jair Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil. Before we delve into his theory, the one that he's promoting now, you must know a few things about the man. Throughout 2020, Mr. Bolsonaro downplayed the severity of this virus. He refused to wear a mask in public. He rejected calls for a lockdown. He questioned the efficacy of the vaccines, even said that it might turn you into an alligator, among other things. He advised his supporters to do the same. The result is this. Today, Brazil, which has just a quarter of India's population, is the third worst hit country in the world. More than 14 million cases, more than 400,000 deaths. Bolsonaro faces a criminal investigation and a possible impeachment over the current state of affairs in his country. With his political future on a sticky wicket, he has suddenly come to realize that the virus is, in fact, quite lethal. That it could be part of a biological war. But does he have proof? He says his military does. You must listen to this.
It's a new virus. Nobody knows if it was born in a lab or because a human ate some animal they shouldn't have. But it is there. And the military knows all about this chemical, biological and radiological warfare. Could we be fighting a new war? I guess. Which country's GDP has grown the most? I'm not going to tell you.
Será que nós estamos enfrentando uma nova guerra? Qual o país que mais cresceu seu PIB? Não vou dizer para vocês.
Needless to say, China won't be happy. What Bolsonaro just said is nothing new, though. Time and again, we've heard similar theories. The virus is not natural, it was made in a lab, it's a bioweapon, and that it could spread even through 5G. Now, this may sound disappointing, but all of these, at best, remain theories. Scientists say there is no evidence whatsoever to back any of these claims, or perhaps they couldn't come across any concrete evidence, perhaps because of the control that China has on the flow of information. Whatever be the reason, there is no proof. So this is where the lab and bio-warfare theory stands. Scientists say if the virus were indeed engineered, there would be evidence of the original genetic code in its DNA, meaning it would have proof of any additions or deletions. but they couldn't find any such change in its genetic code. So it was most likely a natural occurrence. But was the virus leaked? At the onset of the pandemic, there were numerous reports on how the virus accidentally escaped from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The WHO team, which traveled to China to probe its origins, could find no such proof. But then again, it could be because they did not go there in time, or they went under strict supervision of the Chinese. And they also went in January this year, a good 13 months after the virus was first reported. And they came back with more questions than answers. Now, in its report, the WHO team said there were many coronaviruses at the institute, but SARS-CoV-2, what we call the Wuhan virus, was not among them. And hence, the leak hypothesis was extremely unlikely. But the WHO Director General, Dr. Tedros, has said that he does not believe, that his team's assessment of the lab leak possibility was extensive enough, which is very interesting. So he called for a deeper probe into the lab theory. This was on the 31st of March this year. Today is the 6th of May, and the health body is still evaluating how to move forward with its probe. So Mr. Bolsonaro can do two things. Either make his military show us the proof, or wait for the WHO to travel back all the way to China, which we doubt will solve this mystery at all. The oldest sparring partners of Europe are at it again, France and Britain. They have fought over colonies. They have fought over the seas. Today they're fighting over fish. I know it sounds trivial, but it's not. There is big money in fishing, and right now the stakes could not be higher. So how did Europe's Iron Brothers come to a standoff? And where do things go from here? Let's take the first question. Why are Britain and France sparring at all? Because of the most shoddy bit of deal-making in modern history. That's Brexit. Last week, Britain and the EU ratified a post-Brexit agreement. It talks about a new fishing regime in the English Channel. This is the waterway that separates Britain from France, the English Channel. Before Brexit, fishing rights were not an issue because all EU states shared one common fishing area. But the whole point of Brexit was to change this system. So Britain took control of its waters. The new agreement allows French fishermen to keep using the channel, but there's a condition. They cannot be first-timers. The fishermen must have a history of fishing in British waters. Now, the French say their rights are still being restricted, not in mainland Britain, but in a crown dependency to the south, the island of Jersey. Let me pull up the map for you again. Look at how close Jersey is to France. Just 22 kilometers. Now look at the distance from mainland Britain, almost 140 kilometers. A little over 100,000 people live here, and they have their own parliament under the Queen of England. So what role does the UK government play? UK is responsible for Jersey's defence. And we'll tell you why that's important in a bit. But before that, here's something else that you must know. Last Friday, Jersey granted 41 fishing permits. But the fishermen say the permits violated the Brexit agreement. They say additional requirements were added. New clauses were added at the last minute. So what did they do? They gathered their boats and swarmed Jersey. By Thursday morning, 25 French trawlers had arrived. They were threatening to block Jersey's St. Helier port. And these pictures give you an idea of what it looks like. Not exactly sunny sailing conditions. The waters look choppy, and there are some pretty dark clouds in the back. But this is a question of livelihood. So the fishermen were resolved to carry on.
We are not happy with the licensing restrictions they handed out to us. We should have had licenses to fish as we wished without any restrictions on the species. But they impose a restriction on days. Some boats will only be able to fish one type of fish when they used to fish 3 or 4.
But they were not alone in these waters. Britain has deployed 2 Royal Navy ships to Jersey, HMS 7 and HMS Tamer. They're both armed with 2 large guns and a short-range anti-aircraft weapon. What exactly is their mission? Right now, nothing. Downing Street says the ships are there to observe. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has pledged his unwavering support to Jersey. He says any blockade would be unjustified. But then so are naval deployments, and that too over fish. These are men with fishing nets and harpoons, hardly a mission for the Royal Navy. And what about the French? How have they reacted, or should we say overreacted? Because if you thought Britain's naval deployments were pushing it, listen in to what the French are threatening to do.
As you know, the agreement provides for retaliatory measure, and we are ready to use these measures of retaliation. Europe, France has means. They are inscribed in the agreement. Insofar as Jersey is concerned, I'll remind you of electricity transportation via undersea cable. So we have the means, and even if I regret that we could get to this point, we will get there if we must.
That was the French maritime minister. She is talking about cutting off electricity to Jersey. You see, most of the island's power comes from France, almost 95% of it. It is delivered through 3 underwater cables, and France is threatening to turn off this tap. They've also deployed a naval patrol of their own. Now, if this were the Red Sea or the Gulf, we would be having a very different discussion. But this is the English Channel. The chances of France and England having a skirmish are practically nil. But it does reveal the lack of political maturity in Europe. Today was election day in Britain, local body elections, and some critics say that Prime Minister Boris Johnson wanted to flex his muscles ahead of voting. In France, Macron is up for re-election next year. He wants the fishermen on his side. But above all, this standoff is a direct outcome of shoddy deal-making. The UK just wanted Brexit to be over, and the result was this. A lot of contentious issues were ignored. You see, striking a deal and implementing it are 2 very different things. And this is just the start of Britain's worries. Because to the north, an even bigger standoff awaits. Northern Ireland. But that's a discussion for another time. For now, we'll talk about South Africa. A major crackdown is underway. The president of the country, Cyril Ramaphosa, is cleaning up his own party. Several key cities will hold local government elections in October this year, and ahead of those polls, President Ramaphosa is trying to wipe the taint of corruption on his party. A taint left behind by the corruption scandals involving the Gupta family. Here's a report.
It was a sudden announcement. The African National Congress, or the ANC, has suspended Ace Magashule, the Secretary General of the ruling party of South Africa, but he won't go down without a fight.
So yesterday, that's Wednesday, Secretary General Ace Magashule was served with a suspension letter following the National Working Committee's meeting. He was told to refrain from making public pronouncement. But later in the evening, Ace Magashule sent out a scathing statement claiming that he is not only going to appeal the unconstitutional suspension, but in turn sought to suspend the sitting party president, Cyril Ramaphosa.
Suspending a sitting president from his own party is a long shot, even for Magashule, an influential member of the ANC. As Secretary General, Magashule oversaw the day-to-day business of the ruling party. He was a key opponent of President Ramaphosa and a loyalist of former President Jacob Zuma, the man who lost power after the Gupta corruption scandal exploded 4 years ago. Magashule faces serious charges of money laundering and fraud. Reports say that he was part of a Premier League of provincial leaders who backed Zuma through his many scandals. Magashule managed to survive politically after Zuma's exit in 2018, but his fortunes changed last month. President Ramaphosa went before investigators himself. He testified against his own party members. He said that the ANC under Zuma's reign had allowed systemic looting of South Africa over the past decade. It was the most direct acknowledgement ever of state capture by the Guptas.
State capture took place under our watch as the governing party. It involved some members and leaders of our organization, and it found fertile ground in the divisions, in the weaknesses and the tendencies that have developed in our organization since 1994. But we all acknowledge that the organization could and should have done more to prevent the abuse of power.
The South African government estimates that more than $35 billion was stolen from its coffers, largely due to the alleged corruption by Zuma and the Guptas. The ANC faced widespread public anger after Zuma's unceremonious exit. They suffered a major election defeat in the 2016 municipal polls. The ANC lost power in key cities like Johannesburg and HUAWEI. In October, these cities go to the polls again to elect their next government. So in a bid to win back power, Ramaphosa is cracking down on corruption in his own party. In the process, he is also tightening his grip over the ANC. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
America's worst nightmare has come true. For decades, they have marketed themselves as the guardians of democracy. But as it turns out, much of the world sees them as a threat. A bigger threat to democracy than even China and Russia. It is a tough pill to swallow, not just for the US, but even for its critics. So what exactly is the story here? This assessment is based on a worldwide poll on democracy. It is done every year by the Alliance of Democracies Foundation. This time they polled around 50,000 people from 53 countries. They were asked a range of questions, like how they rank freedom of speech or the influence of big tech and social media. But the most striking question was this one. Who is the biggest threat? Who are the biggest threats to democracy? And this is how the world answered. 44% respondents named the United States, 38% named China, 28% Russia. At first glance, it doesn't make much sense. But remember, this is not about internal democracy, it's about global democracy. Just think about America's checkered past. Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, Vietnam, these are countries they invaded and destabilized. What we're trying to say is this, that the US is the larger power here. They are involved all over the world. In comparison, China and Russia have a limited sphere of influence. So in a global survey, it is natural for more people to fear the US. But that doesn't mean that America is off the hook. This survey is a reality check for Washington. They want to be the chief guardian of democracy, but with a negative rating of 44%, that's a difficult claim. So is there a silver lining for the US? Well, there is. A large chunk of the negative ratings came from Russia and China, two of America's biggest rivals. And compared to last year, America's ratings have actually improved. So this survey should serve as a lesson. Democracy is not anyone's monopoly. The United States is a democracy, but so is Germany, so is India, Japan, and dozens of other countries, and each of them follow their own system. And this is what America finds hard to accept. It believes that democracy is what happens in Washington. What does the survey have to say about this? 81% of respondents endorse democracy. They say it's the best form of government despite everything. But 44% of them also trash the US. So the bottom line is this: the world wants democracy, but not the democracy dictated by the United States. Let's tell you a little more about the findings. Not just countries, some businesses also featured on it. And no prizes for guessing which one. Big tech. 48% people view tech companies as a threat to democracy. In the US, that figure is almost 62%. People fear tech giants more than curbs on free speech. How ironic is that? Tech firms always use the argument of free speech to block regulation. Turns out they are the bigger villain, and everyone knows that. So the United States, tech giants, China. These are the big threats to democracy, but one indicator ranked higher than all three of these. And it's not something you would guess. Economic inequality. 64% people called it the biggest threat to democracy. It is linked to the ongoing Wuhan virus pandemic. It has put millions of people out of jobs. In 2020, 70% people were happy with their government's pandemic response. This was in both democracies and non-democracies, but 1 year later, democracies have fallen to 51%. Why is that? Well, look at China and you'll understand why. They ignored human rights. They consulted no one on lockdowns. They punished people who dissented. You see, decision-making is easier in autocracies because they do not care about the impact. They do not even have to worry about getting more and more people on board. So what are the big takeaways from the survey? Number one, America is not judge and jury. The Star-Spangled Banner is not the chorus for democracy. Number two, this is not an endorsement of either China or Russia. Their human rights record speaks for themselves. Number three, don't trust everything that you see in a poll. In this one, 71% Chinese said that they had the right amount of democracy. 71% in China. Now, if the right amount is none, then yes, they're right. But the biggest takeaway is this. Democracy works. And we do not need superpowers or big corporations to defend it. In fact, we need them to stay away. And as we hope for a better future, we continue to struggle with the past. Most countries stumble when it comes to answering one question. How do we deal with the nation's history? How do we deal with leaders from history? And the question has never been more relevant than now. Last year, we saw statues of leaders like Winston Churchill being torn down. The once decorated leaders are now being called out for racism. So how do we deal with their history? Do we accept it as it is, or do we whitewash it? French President Emmanuel Macron has said that history must be confronted. He recently laid a wreath at the tomb of Napoleon Bonaparte, commemorated 200 years of the emperor's death. Macron's speech and gesture made headlines because they were rare. Most presidents would not do it. And to understand why most presidents would not do it, we must revisit history. Who was this man, Napoleon Bonaparte? One of the most divisive emperors in history. A man who was recently called an icon of white supremacy. Napoleon was born in Italy, then Italy, on the 15th of August, 1769. He was educated at 3 schools. He mostly spoke Spanish and could barely interact in French. And for this, his classmates ridiculed him. He graduated from a military academy in Paris with a fairly low rank. He became a second lieutenant in the French army, and by then, his father had died of stomach cancer. Napoleon was not the oldest son, but he took charge of the family at the age of 16. At 23, he fought for a leader who was supporting Corsica's independence from France. This is where he used to live. And when this man won, he turned against Napoleon. The family had to flee to France. The year was 1793. French King Louis XVI had been beheaded. France was now a republic. Napoleon's rise began with the French Revolution. He led a military expedition to recapture the city of Toulon. He quashed a rebellion in Paris. At the age of 27, he was appointed the commander of French forces in Italy. His troops conquered much of Italy and parts of Austria. Napoleon became a hero. His military planning, rapid marches, and war strategy boosted his position in France. He defeated the Egyptian forces. He even tried invading modern-day Syria. But when he failed, he deserted his army and returned to France. Then he staged a coup, overthrew the 5-man executive body in France, and became the first consul. The year was 1799. Napoleon was all of 30, married, and this was just the beginning of his climb. He led France, reformed the education and banking systems, instituted what is called the Napoleonic Code, much like the modern-day penal code. At 33, he became the first consul for life. Then he crowned himself the Emperor of France. He censured opposition, exiled his critics, installed several paintings of himself in prominent buildings. History also remembers Napoleon for restoring slavery, restricting women's rights. But what he is remembered for the most are his wars. Under Napoleon's 10-year rule of France, the country was almost always at war. In 1803, Napoleon sold modern-day Louisiana to U.S. President Thomas Jefferson for $15 million. He used the money to fund wars. He tried fighting the British Royal Navy and failed. He fought the Russians, defeated the Austrians twice, destroyed the Prussian army. By 1807, he had control of most of Western and Central Europe, and his law was applicable in all of these lands. But Napoleon knew his forces would never be able to take on the British Royal Navy, so he introduced a blockade on British trade, forbade European countries from trading with Britain. The system failed. European countries, including Russia, pulled out of the trade blockade. To punish Russia, Napoleon decided to invade it. He failed miserably. He lost 5,000 of his troops to cold weather and disease. The year was 1813. Napoleon was 44 years old. It was his worst defeat ever. Within a year, forces from Russia, Britain, Spain, Austria and Prussia invaded France. Napoleon was forced to abdicate, and he was exiled to the island of Elba in the Mediterranean. He came to France 1 year later. He regained power, but this time his rule lasted all of 100 days. Napoleon was defeated in the Battle of Waterloo, exiled to the island of St. Helena, far from France, where he was monitored by British guards. Myth has it that Napoleon was very short. Turns out this myth was started by British troops. Napoleon's life ended like a Shakespearean tragedy with a sense of catharsis. He died within 6 years of exile. He was 52 years old. To some, he remains a military genius. To some, an emblem of French supremacy. But for much of Europe, he is one of the continent's most divisive leaders, a blot to European history. From a minor noble family, Napoleon went on to become the ruler of much of continental Europe. His story has a message for all of us. Each one of us has the ability to change the course of history, but it is up to us to decide which way we want to steer it. Too much talk of history, let's talk about the future. Technology can be magical, but technology can also be dangerous. I'm not referring to artificial intelligence and the fear of robots taking over our jobs or things that complex. I'm talking about a machine, one that's comparatively much simpler, a treadmill. A best-selling treadmill that has killed a 6-year-old child, injured another 4-year-old, and trapped many pets, also broken the bones of many adults. Our next report brings you the details of this curious case.
Over 125,000 treadmills have been recalled across the United States and the UK. They are by a company called Peloton. Earlier this year, a 6-year-old child had died after being pulled underneath its treadmill. Around the same time, a 3-year-old suffered head injuries after being trapped under a Peloton treadmill. The company called it a tragic accident. Its CEO published a letter assuring that his company cares about the health and wellness of its customers. This was in the month of March. Soon, 72 people reported injuries. Some reported cuts and bruises, others broken bones. These reports were coming from the US, the UK and Canada. How was a machine meant to make people healthy becoming a threat to their lives? Turns out, Peloton's treadmills are not ordinary. They can be connected to virtual fitness classes. They come with fancy touchscreens and set you back by $4,300. Almost 3,17,000 Indian rupees. Unlike most treadmills, Peloton's machines have a large gap between the floor and the belt, and that leaves enough space for injuries and mishaps. In the last few months, pets and objects have been pulled under the treadmill. This was something no one had seen coming. When the pandemic struck, Peloton's treadmills became a rage. They offered everything you needed to stay fit at home. In 2020, Peloton reported $1.8 billion in revenue, up $915 million from the previous year. As orders hit sky high, the company struggled with supply. Soon, the treadmill's touchscreen began loosening. In at least 6 cases, they fell from the tread. Injured people and damaged the company's reputation. Peloton's CEO now says his company made a mistake by not recalling the treadmills sooner. Reports say that Peloton has lost $4 billion in market value in just a day. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
The best note to end on, but we're out of time. We're leaving you with Gravitas images. Thanks very much for watching. Stay safe.